Thank you, Stephanie, and I'm glad to be here. Have the opportunity to talk with you all this afternoon. Let me just go ahead and get my screen share set up and we'll get going. Okay, I think we should be up and ready to go. All right, so I'll do a presentation. I guess the plan is for about 25-30 minutes to give an overview of the paper, describe some of the reasoning behind it, and then allocate some time at the end for us all to talk over some of the issues at stake on this topic of setting data science teacher education goals. So the overall motivation for the article is kind of up on the screen here for us. And so we've had a recent surge, of course, of development in pre-K-12 data science curricula. Um, One of the lessons from history, though, that those of us in math and statistics education and other branches of education have learned sometimes the hard way is that if we don't have the appropriate teacher education infrastructure, even if it's a great curriculum, it doesn't have a great chance of success. So that's really the initial motivation for this article is to try to help build some of the infrastructure that's needed for that teacher education piece. And so the goal here is to describe a process that's flexible per the curriculum that the teachers are charged with teaching that can be used to set some explicit goals to guide that whole enterprise of in-service and pre-service teacher education. So definitely not going to get into every single teacher education goal that could possibly be set in this presentation, but hopefully we'll give a helpful model to get things started along those lines. One of the big reasons I think that that's important is that if we don't engage in that explicit goal setting process, it's really easy to have our teacher education initiatives guided by some of these maybe not terribly helpful implicit theories. And you can probably think of examples of when you've maybe seen programs or maybe even felt yourself or your own program being pulled in one of these directions. So the first two up here, kind of implicit things that can guide goals at times relate to subject matter knowledge. This idea, even if it's not explicitly said, but sometimes programs send the message that if you know the subject well, you should be able to teach it. Or just a more simplistic kind of thing like teachers should know more than their students. Now, certainly subject matter knowledge is important, but it's really easy to get totally preoccupied with just those types of goals. So I think that's one of the reasons explicit goals are important. On the flip side of it, you might also be able to think of programs or times when things have been influenced too much on just the general pedagogy side of it. And that might lead to things like unstructured field experiences that don't really have a direct connection to the content at hand. And so that's the other side of it that I think it's good to avoid is to have a balance and to have an integration between the content and the pedagogy aspect. So that's really what the model that we'll talk about this afternoon seeks to do. So going with, that beginning thought that subject matter knowledge provides the basis for all of this. Now that, of course, is probably the first huge challenge in setting teacher education goals is defining the subject matter knowledge. And I'm sure we've all seen Venn diagrams that do, give us a sense of what that's like. This is a Venn diagram from an article that I cited in the JSDSE article that I'm presenting on now. And I think this does a nice job of showing that we have these overlaps between various disciplines, math, statistics, computing, content knowledge, bringing these various things together gets us to this discipline of data science education. And of course, that continues to shift and evolve and develop as new things come along, but at least gives us a starting point to think about this different cross-disciplinary integration that feeds into data science. And we each have a stake in, various aspects of that. So with that as a beginning thought for what the subject matter knowledge terrain might look like, what I wanted to do with this article is to try to bring together teacher education theory that's relevant to those different disciplinary areas. So with the thought that, we want to go beyond just subject matter knowledge, this model brings together some work that's been done, some theory on statistical knowledge for teaching, mathematical knowledge for teaching, and technological, pedagogical, statistical knowledge. It's going to be an imperfect model to begin with, I'm sure. And you immediately looking at it, you might think, well, what other aspects might there be? As it turns out, this will give us a ton to talk about and really produce many more goals than we can cover in a curriculum, but we'll use it as a starting point for this afternoon. So having a look at the diagram in the middle, those of you that are familiar with the mathematical knowledge for teaching model that's cited in the heading here, probably will remember that egg diagram was a two-dimensional oval that they had that depicted these different knowledge sectors. So this diagram, just to relate it back to that visual is similar, takes it out to 3 dimensions to accommodate the purple plane that you see cutting across these different sections. So knowledge of technology on the left-hand side, along with these elements of subject matter knowledge, and then pedagogical, statistical, technological knowledge on the right side to go along with these elements of pedagogical content knowledge. So as with any model, it will admit up front it's an imperfect model. I do think, though, and I'll give some examples of why I think it's a helpful model to get us started out in a productive direction with data science teacher education goals. I actually have a discussion question at the end to look at the theory of this a little bit more. For example, as I look back on this a couple of days ago, I thought, well, maybe it would be better to have this purple plane be more of a thick rectangular prism that cuts through the orb because of the pronounced role of technology in doing data science. So we'll hopefully get into some of those discussions as we go along this afternoon as well. All right, so what I would like to do is just kind of give an example, give a sense of what this model of teacher knowledge looks like by exemplifying the different sectors briefly. So I'll just be going from left to right. If you do have the article in front of you, that might help kind of follow along with the next few slides. And then toward the end, talk about how this model of teacher knowledge plays into actions that we would like to prepare teachers to be able to do as part of the teacher education that we offer. So the far left side of the orb, this common content knowledge sector, might possibly be the easiest to define. So this is the knowledge, the disciplinary knowledge, the subject matter knowledge that teachers, students, and data science all have a common need for. So these are things that are in the curriculum that teachers need to know, students need to know, and they're also used by data scientists. So we have that overlap. There are a lot of new things. I mean, just within the past decade, I've underlined and bolded some of these as you look through the list here of helping teachers think about non-traditional data, cleaning, transforming, and managing data, evaluating the pedigree of the data, the new technologies that are used for data science. It's very tempting to focus specifically on those and really not progress much at all beyond this slide because honestly, it looks like that would be more than enough to fill more than an entire course. But I think the danger there is that we're missing some things. I mean, what research tells us about the structure of teachers' professional knowledge does go beyond this. So I think it's helpful to push ourselves to think, okay, what else, if we're going to offer an optimal teacher education program, what else does this theory suggest we might need to include in terms of teacher education goals? So moving over to the next sector in the orb diagram, the next category of subject matter knowledge is this idea of specialized content knowledge. So this is subject matter knowledge, but it's subject matter knowledge that's specifically needed for teaching. So this type of knowledge helps teachers unpack ideas for students. It's a level of detail that can help teachers make the discipline begin to be accessible to students. Expert data scientists may well, and certainly in most cases, yeah, can develop this knowledge, but they don't necessarily need it to carry out their day-to-day work. Teachers, on the other hand, need to have knowledge in the middle example here of tools that help that are accessible to students. They need to know how those technological tools work. Data scientists operating professionally can go to the most efficient, the most powerful technologies, teachers need knowledge of some of the intermediate steps, some of the intermediate technologies that lead up to that, creating a need for something like CODAP. Data scientists may never need to use that in their work. Teachers, though, as part of that scaffolding process, benefit greatly from that specific piece of technology. So if you think about the orb diagram, that's kind of part of the purple plane that cuts through subject matter knowledge, as knowledge of those types of technologies. Outside of the technology plane, of course, there are also some non-technological aspects. In the literature, there is more being written about the importance of teachers being able to do things in an unplugged manner as well. So the example I have up on the screen here is teaching randomization tests. Being able to represent that not just with technology, but using concrete materials like data cards. Again, that's something that's specifically helpful in the capacity of teaching. It's an element of subject matter knowledge, but it's not something an expert would need to do on a day-to-day basis as part of their work. All right, and one more aspect of subject matter knowledge to consider for now, this idea of horizon knowledge. So horizon knowledge gives teachers a view of the discipline beyond what their students see in the curriculum. It helps teachers know where the curriculum eventually leads and also what's beyond that, how the profession works. And just as the name implies, horizon knowledge is going to be relative to where you are. So your horizon changes as your position changes. So for example, on an earlier slide, R and Python were given as examples of common content knowledge for secondary teachers implementing curricula that include those technologies. Elementary curricula generally not going to include those technologies. But you might ask, is it helpful for elementary teachers to have some knowledge of those technologies? Maybe not as in depth, but if they do know them, are they more likely to look for openings in the curriculum to scaffold students in doing the kinds of logical reasoning that are needed to function within those environments? So horizon knowledge is another possibly helpful aspect to kind of round out the picture of subject matter knowledge in the model that's presented in the paper. Okay, moving over to the right side of the orb, a few examples of pedagogical content knowledge. So now we're really getting specifically into making subject matter comprehensible to students, the dynamics of more of the dynamics of what's involved in that. To me, when you shift over to pedagogical content knowledge, in some cases, this is the type of knowledge you're likely to develop in a classroom setting, working directly with students, especially this first category of knowledge of content and students. So this helps teachers anticipate the problem-solving strategies, maybe the points of confusion that students will have for specific aspects of the curriculum and specific aspects of the content. It's a little bit different, in my view, from specialized content knowledge. Specialized content knowledge helps teachers unpack the content. But on the other hand, knowledge of content and students helps with the anticipation of how students are likely to think about the content or interact with the content. Using the technology example, it's very possible to be adept at doing things with technology like CODAP and have that specialized knowledge. But knowing what younger students are likely to do with it is a whole different category. And it's helpful to have that because that'll inform how you go about introducing it, how you structure your lessons. On a software design level, it would influence the choices ideally that you would make with that end of things too. Another example that's not necessarily technology, but technology related. In the paper, I cited an example of a study, an old study that it looked at how students intuitively structured data sets. One of the interesting findings in that particular study was that many students favored methods other than the flat case by attribute matrix structure that you would see in a spreadsheet and would make data easy to work with in practice. and found it more intuitive to work with data cards where information about each case was represented on an individual card. It's another one of those things then that has implications for how we go about teaching it, which is going to be our next category of knowledge, by the way, here too. And just to close this one out, I think this is a really intriguing area for research because we're just beginning to understand how younger children think about some of these new topics in the curriculum. There are a few examples and a few studies cited below here. These are all the references, by the way, are from the article. I also included the references on a slide later on if you'd like to dig into some of these in more detail. Okay, so where knowledge of content and students helps us anticipate how students might interact with content, knowledge of content and teaching is related to that. It helps us to design and select teaching strategies to support students' learning of that specific content. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, knowledge of content and students can often be a basis to develop knowledge of content and teaching. So that example earlier that knowing that students might find it more intuitive to work with data sets that are represented on data cards then would lead you to go in that direction with having them organize data. I think it's also important in this category to note that it's content specific. It's not general pedagogy. So it pertains to specific things we'd like students to do in data science. The example that's in this next portion of the slide talks about a teaching strategy to support 9 and 10-year-olds in statistical investigations. And so you can see why part of it may well be valuable as part of teacher education to include those kinds of pedagogical structures that are specific to the content so that teachers have that in their options of ways to approach the teaching of data science. One last thing on knowledge of content and teaching that I think is really intriguing is that we're asking teachers across many disciplines, including mathematics, other disciplines, to do things that they really have not done a lot of before. I mean, one example of that would be ethics. So looking at the teaching of ethics, imagine a mathematics teacher prepared like I was a long time ago and there wouldn't be a thought that ethics would, that you would necessarily have students thinking about ethical issues and doing that kind of reasoning. So I think that's another intriguing piece that comes into play with data science is what are the teaching strategies that it's ideal for mathematics teachers and teachers of other disciplines to know that maybe haven't traditionally been part of teacher preparation. So I think that's one of the values of considering this specific model is it pushes us in some of those directions as well. To wrap up the pedagogical content knowledge section of the orb, there's one last category to the far right called curriculum knowledge. The pieces of that I'd like to just highlight for right now are from Schulman's original definition way back in 1986 in his original paper on the concept of pedagogical content knowledge. He talked about these ideas of lateral components and vertical components of curriculum knowledge. The lateral element of that, I think, is especially intriguing for data science because think about how we prepare, especially elementary school teachers, to teach across a variety of subject areas. Um, there are a lot of opportunities potentially there to work across subject areas, perhaps in the methods courses that they take, perhaps in the content courses, but thinking about like what are the pieces of horizontal integration across disciplines. Vertical curriculum knowledge, another, I think, intriguing piece for data science. The Data Science for Everyone project at one point talked about planning tool progressions that extend over many grade levels. So having teachers know that, the work that I do with CODAP in this grade level is eventually going to build to more and more sophisticated tools as students go through their grade levels is another potentially valuable piece of information, another potentially valuable aspect of a teacher education program to have. Um, so that's a quick look at the categories. The article also includes a diagram that attempts to help sort of disambiguate and differentiate between the different categories. I won't go into a lot of detail about that right now, but that might be a helpful reference. I do think for the purpose of setting goals, I'm not convinced that it's super important to perfectly distinguish between these. I do think it's important to keep all of these elements in mind in setting goals. But in some cases, we may well want to have goals where, we're not sure. Is it knowledge of content and students? Is it knowledge of content and teaching? Is it some amalgam of the two? I think the important thing is that we address those pieces and don't neglect the different aspects of the model. But that diagram might just be a helpful kind of summary of some of the differences that you might see among those knowledge categories. So just in that quick set of examples of the different types of teacher knowledge, I think we already have an overwhelming number of goals. But just to summarize what's going on in some of those past slides, we really have or at least the way that I set it up, we have three different things feeding into the actions we would like teachers to take to support pre-K-12 students' attainment of data science learning outcomes. So we've got the subject matter knowledge aspects, pedagogical content knowledge aspects, and then the curriculum aspects, the curriculum that we've set for pre-K-12 data science, all feeding into these and then producing possibly desirable goals for data science teacher education. So I'd like to just go through an example of just bringing that all together and apply it to the CSTA standards, a few CSTA standards for grades K through 2. The specific ones we'll have a quick look at are over on the right of the screen. So they have a standard for that grade band of store, copy, retrieve, modify, delete information using a computing device and define the information as data, collect and present the same data in various visual formats, and identify and describe patterns in data visualizations to make predictions. Those three standards all translate directly into that first knowledge category of common content knowledge. So we certainly want teachers to be able to do those things. It's part of the curriculum. But as in the previous examples, there are also likely to be goals that we want to set for them that go beyond just being able to do what students do. So some examples along those lines. This is an illustration from a study I did a few years ago. It connects to this goal of collecting and presenting the same data in various visual formats. So these are 4 graphs that students produced. And I was surprised in my work with teachers. So I had some pre-service teachers teaching a series of lessons, and these were some of the graphs that students produced when they encouraged them to display the data in a way that made sense to them. And it was kind of surprising to me that my prospective teachers really focused on graph A and graph B as being the most similar to start with because they both had bars. So the pre-service teachers I worked with focused kind of on that cosmetic feature of bars. The difference, though, is on the graph on the left, the bars aggregate the data, show how many times 18 comes up in the data set, how many times 17 comes up, etc. The one on the right gives each data point its own bar. So it's a little bit like the case value bars that you see sometimes in other literature. So that was kind of an eye-opener for me that it's not automatic that teachers develop that sort of specialized content knowledge of being able to evaluate like a non-conventional representation a student has produced and make sense of it and the mathematics or statistics that's going on within it. And then that really, I think, goes hand in hand with an item of knowledge of content and students that we would like teachers to develop is to be able to anticipate which types of graphs students might construct given their backgrounds, their grade levels, and other factors. What all plays into that? What can I anticipate students doing in my own classroom? So those two elements go beyond common content knowledge. An example on this next slide of a possible horizon knowledge goal related to this CSTA standard of store, copy, retrieve, modify data. It may be valuable for teachers to know how data scientists go about their work and be able to explain how data cleaning is an essential part of the work of data scientists, maybe give examples of its use in practice. In grades K through 2, they may never um, share that directly or have students engage in that sort of work. But in theory, if they are familiar with that, will it help them look for opportunities in the curriculum to have students be more conscious of looking for spotting inaccuracies, fixing up, cleaning up data, and eventually having that build up to using more sophisticated tools for large data sets as they progress through to the later grade levels? And I believe this is the last example of standard setting related to the CSTA standards I have for now. Going back to the data cards example, thinking about the value of having teachers being able to design and implement student activities that involve sorting and scanning data cards to identify patterns and draw conclusions relates to an element of knowledge of content and teaching. And then the idea from earlier, knowing of activities, both technology-based and unplugged activities that involve sorting those cards and then using that to scaffold up toward using CodeApp and then eventually more sophisticated technologies. That overall progression in lessons and stringing together several teaching strategies to offer a coherent curriculum to students that builds on itself. An example possibly of knowledge that we would want teachers to have of the curriculum. So, again, just in those few examples, it seems pretty overwhelming, and I haven't even gone into every possible example we possibly could. So I really think that this goal setting, I think it's necessary, I think it's important, and I think we have to do it in order to not be pulled in directions that might not acknowledge the complexity of teacher knowledge, but at the same time, I think that it leads to more work that needs to be done as we set goals using the model. So on the left side, just some of the theoretical development that it would still be beneficial to do. So setting these goals, and then continuing to refine the model to reflect new and emerging sets of goals. We're going to have different priorities come up in terms of disciplinary knowledge. We may find that some of these plausibly overlap, and that should be represented more clearly in the model. We might find that it's important to emphasize some aspects of the model other than more than others. Having clarity on some of those issues, I think, helps refine the theoretical aspect and kind of help us along in that way. The right branch of it pertains more to the practice of teacher education. So the idea of setting goals, designing teacher education experiences that are based on them, and then taking the next step after that and assessing the impact on children's learning. This branch of it actually reminds me of if you familiar way back with one of the groundbreaking projects to do that was cognitively guided instruction. So they would design teacher professional development, have teachers go through it. They actually had a control group in a study, and then they compared what were the children's learning outcomes for teachers that had the different types of professional development. I think that sort of thing is another really productive area for research. So that initial goal setting, can be done. Experiences can be designed, but then looking at the impact on classroom level data could be really valuable. And again, refining the goals and identifying the ones that are the most important. Okay, so for the discussion part of our session this afternoon, I went ahead and set up suggestions for some discussion prompts of each branch, kind of the theoretical branch on the left, and more of the teacher education practice branch on the right. So I think what I'd like to do is go ahead and give you the first set of prompts on theory and research. I think we've got what, maybe 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes or so if we could discuss in breakout rooms. Here's a look at what I thought might be interesting to discuss along those lines. So first one here pertains to just the model that's represented to the right. Do you have suggestions for other cross-cutting plans other than technology or maybe other refinements to it? What kinds of research maybe would we be able to conduct to help identify which teacher education goals are most important to emphasize or prioritize? And then just a more open prompt here, other questions, comments, or observations related to the research and theory end of it. All right, welcome back. I think we have everyone back in the main room. That was a very short amount of time, I think, to dig into some of these issues, but I would just like to go ahead and check in to see if any of the breakout rooms or any representatives from the breakout rooms would like to share any insights or discussion points that they came up with in just those few minutes.
I'm
Okay,
happy.
so go ahead. Go ahead.
Uh, Something that came up in our discussion group with Catherine and Jeff, I guess. Uh, we didn't get the prompt in our discussion groups or in our breakout rooms, so we were remembering whatever we remembered from before. But what we were thinking is that applications, like for students to see applications is really important, or that's what we are seeing in the classrooms, that students get engaged through applications of data science. And we weren't quite sure whether that's covered in the theoretical framework that you put together or whether it goes into the horizon knowledge that you described. So that's kind of our group summary.
Okay, so applications that you would specifically find in the curriculum, or what types of applications did you have in mind?
Like application of whatever you might be teaching them in the data science curriculum. And Catherine brought up, like she does a biostatistics boot camp. Yeah, maybe Catherine,
right,
you
so
can.
again, it's kind of like, I guess teachers and speakers have to know their audience. In my particular program, it's an NIH funded summer program to teach biostatistics, data science, epidemiology, and data science. And it targets groups typically underrepresented in the biomedical sciences. So in order to engage the students, I thought hard about it. And I thought, well, if they come from either mostly, who knows, I didn't make the assumption, but I was thinking that perhaps they came from groups with lower income, and therefore they had a greater risk of illness, disease, and the more social determinants of health that are non-medical explanations of more severe disease and a greater prevalence of disease. And, the reviewers liked it. I find in engaging the students, this is going to be, we're going to be going into our 5th year. The prior 4 years, it was a hook. It was important, to engage the students.
Yeah, so the context piece of it, and I see someone contributed in the chat along those lines, possibly context in data investigations as a potential cross-cutting theme in the model. Yeah, and the other thing that reminds me of is that idea of lateral curriculum knowledge and knowing how these things fit together. It's one of these subjects that I don't think we can get away with just assigning this to mathematics teachers and then, just hoping for the best. I think we need to think about what are the connections across content areas. How can we build those into teacher education programs? Definitely. All right, thank you.
I just want to add
If
one
I
more
might,
thing. I just want to add one more thing about, I see increasingly over time that the students are more concerned about getting a job when they graduate. And, perhaps some uses, applications that relate to sponsors or people who hire entry-level employees could be, an important hook.
Right. And I immediately thought about the horizon knowledge piece, knowing about what data scientists do in their daily work. And beyond that, what occupations are available? What does this lead to beyond the pre-K-12 curriculum?
I was just going to add, like, as I was listening to your talk and, our group discussion, like the analogy that I'm thinking of is when I learned math, or, if I learned how to solve simultaneous equations, I could engage and, embrace the beauty of math in there without really knowing that that same algorithm that I'm using is actually used to steer rockets to target, right? So the math teacher didn't really need to tell me about this particular application of solving simultaneous equations. But when you're looking at data, if you're just looking at wrangling data and cleaning it, it's drudgery at its best. So having students do it because it's coming from, answering this question seems more engaging. Um, and those were the applications that we were thinking of. And didn't quite know where it fits in the framework, but maybe, as you said, it's in the horizon knowledge box.
It does remind me of aspects of that as well as the cross-curriculum knowledge. And so, but I think you're right. You're absolutely right that you don't want to just teach techniques and the mechanics of it in isolation of a meaningful context. That I would agree that would seem to be counterproductive, that you do want these to be situated in authentic situations. Because that problem of transfer, I mean, yeah, certainly as you gave an example, you might you might have some technical knowledge that is useful across different contexts, but never really know that it is unless you use it for that purpose at some point. Okay, thank you. Any other groups that are ready to report? We do have a little bit of time, it looks like, for another round of breakout rooms. And if we get to that, I'll drop the prompts in the chat before we go into breakout rooms. It looks like I need to do that before we go into breakout rooms again. But if anyone does have other thoughts on the first breakout room, please go ahead and contribute before we break into rooms again for the last part. Okay, I'm going to go ahead then and grab the second set of discussion prompts and get those into the chat right away before our next breakout room segment.
I can add a quick comment from my group. It was just about the assessment part and how scary it looks. And I'm wondering if we are already doing some of the mini steps before we get to the students and see how much more they're learning and if they are. So
by that pitch, so he'll get first base Alex Cora.
Okay, I think so. You were mentioning the assessment piece. So, did you have in mind the assessment of teachers or students or both parties, maybe?
I think John started talking about when we get, I think, the final part of actually assessing the students, based on the different ways we teach the teachers, and then I took a step back and I'm like, I'm wondering if we're assessing the teachers in the way we should assess the teachers, and then kind of following the step-by-step way so that at the end we can have like a good research, a good assessment. So I think I'm more of a pessimist. I'm like, are we even doing the first step correct? Are we assessing the teachers in the way that we should assess them? But it's just the magnitude of the research once you get to the student knowledge and whether that is improved. It's just scary to think of that part, and the type of assessments and everything.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a humongous undertaking. I do think, it probably, like as you're suggesting, looking at some intermediate steps, like how can we work up to that more, large scale sort of research. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is that's maybe a little bit more accessible in the short term is following teachers into their classrooms after the professional development is done, or even alongside the professional development and kind of situating the professional development within their classrooms. And looking at the effects of, okay, is this helping them? Are there pieces that we didn't include that it might be helpful and would help them carry out instruction in their classrooms? So, yeah, I appreciate the thought that the diagram that I had up there is biting off a very large piece to begin with. But yeah, thank you for that. I think that does bring out the idea that there are ways we can work up to it. We don't have to necessarily uh, go to the children's level immediately as what the children are learning. I think that's, ideal to get there, but yeah, definitely with funding, time, all of those different factors. There are other ways we can get at the impacts that these programs might be having on teachers. So yeah, thank you. All right, I think since we're uh, down to about 10 minutes, I think what I'd like to do instead of moving back and forth between breakout rooms is let me just go ahead and put the last three discussion prompts into the chat. So I've posted those there for everyone to have a look at. If you could take a moment, read those. If you have any reactions to them, I'd be really interested to hear what you have to think. Or for that matter, if you have leftover thoughts from the first breakout room, please go ahead and contribute those. But I'll be quiet for a minute to let you read through those and kind of process your thoughts. And please go ahead and contribute what you would like. I got a message. They're not coming through. Oh, I know what happened. I sent okay, let me try this again. I have to reset who my messages are going to. So, all right, try again. Okay, I think they came through that time. So as you're thinking about those, I guess just to get us started out on these, I just offer a quick thought on the second one. I work in a college of education, and at the elementary level, we have social studies methods courses, mathematics teaching methods courses, science teaching methods courses. And so one group of individuals that comes to mind for prospective teacher preparation is coordinating the efforts across those groups. What data science teacher education goals would make sense in each of those different settings, and how can we work together to decide like what kind of an impact are these having if we include them in our courses. So that's one example of something that came to mind for me in regard to that second discussion prompt. To finish us up today, I'd like to just open it up to others and see if there are any other things that came to mind for other people in the Zoom session.
Randy, this is Larry. Is there, I don't know if this is something you've done, but is there a way to sort of have all these different types of knowledge on one axis and another axis having all the different potential partners and stakeholders? so that we kind of see who's focusing on what pieces of this.
That sounds like an excellent article to me, Larry. I think that's an awesome idea. Because I think it's so, and it's needed work too, because this is such a, we're all kind of new at this, doing this sort of coordination, like who is on the map, like you're suggesting, and is there a way that we could represent that would make it more manageable to think about? It's not something that I've taken a shot at, but I do think that would be very valuable.
And like you say, this might play out very differently in different institutions based on, like you were just saying, how, some institutions separate the College of Ed stuff from the College of Science stuff. And, and if everyone just says, well, the other guys will take care of it, or everything's important to everyone, and then the result is that nothing happens. And I don't know, there's got to be some other vision here.
Yeah, having it be institution specific, that I think is super important. But yeah, I also agree with that idea that it's great to integrate things, but if it's not monitored systematically, that's been my experience too, is that it tends to get lost. If it's not within a group's domain or within a department's domain, yeah, you have to take a lot of care that it just doesn't get lost across those groups.
And another question I have is, like with Japanese lesson study, no one does that to every lesson they teach. But the thinking is, if you go through the process for one topic, then in your head you will have the right instincts for everything else you do without doing a full-fledged formal lesson study again. I wonder what types of knowledge have that kind of flavor, that if there's not time to do all those types of knowledge on every topic, is there a way to do it really deeply for a particular topic that will just prime the mind to look for it on the others, even if it's not explicitly covered? Does that make sense?
So if I understand you, it's like developing habits of mind that then kind of leads you to do the type of reasoning you need to do to develop the knowledge that you need to teach the curriculum. And yeah, I mean that again, since the knowledge that will be needed is going to change over time, yeah, the reasoning piece certainly help with that, or it's essential for that, really.
And is there a one-stop clearinghouse of all these types of knowledge that could just be built and added to collectively as a community, where we're not all independently creating this from?
I was going to chime in to say I'm Kirsten Daler from West Ed. Apologies to be late to the conversation, but there's an international group that's been looking at the pedagogical content knowledge for science teachers in the 21st century. And there has been a lot of discussion about integration, but also about teacher preparation, where data is the great integrator. I'm thinking interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. But thinking about giving teachers themselves a deep firsthand experience with the use of data, and then looking at the implications of student work, of curriculum in various disciplines, content disciplines, in addition, so that you're getting the layering in as you're developing the pedagogical content knowledge, whether you're looking at student work that is more math-based from that firsthand experience of working with data. So it's really a great conversation to hear, and also interesting to see how it's connecting to what's happening with some of our international colleagues as well. Thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Thank you.
If I might add, we have a grant here at UC Santa Barbara to kind of develop pathways from community college to California state universities to the UCs. And something that has really worked well to kind of expose high school students and community college students to data science has been, I can say two things. One is kind of outreach programs where we just have a data day across the institutions in the grant and expose students and the teachers who bring the students to the campus or to the data day, just indulge in a quick exposure to data science. So that's been very helpful. And the second thing is we are having a community of practice where experienced and soon to be data science teachers are coming together for right now it's just half a year from January to May where we have a community of practice, and everyone is just discussing various aspects of the curriculum, and then the teachers are soon to be instructors of data science or introductory data science classes are getting the exposure to what they might uh, face or the challenging situations and things to avoid and what data to use, what data sets are good, what is bad, and how to go about various things. So that community has been really great is what the first time data science teachers are experiencing.
And it's a good
And we are
opportunity for, yeah, go ahead.
We're thinking of ways in which we can expand it. So, any thoughts or ideas I'd be interested in hearing as well. Like what would be useful to do or how to collaborate with others at other institutions to push this forward.
Yeah, it's definitely an important piece of the puzzle. How do we serve practicing teachers? For me anyway, that in the work that I do, it's easy for me to get caught up in just, okay, what do we do with prospective teachers? But yeah, that's a great example of an experience that we can provide for practicing teachers too, that haven't had these experiences as part of their initial teacher preparation, or for that matter, the increasing numbers of people we've had that are teaching that weren't in a licensure program. They're maybe going through alternative licensure pathways and need support beyond their college prep programs. Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the session and offering your viewpoints. Um, Happy to answer any follow-up questions or hear any thoughts you have after the session. So please feel free to get in touch with anything that comes to mind afterward. But I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thanks again for attending the session.
Thanks, Randy. Really appreciate you leading this for us.
Yep, thank you for the opportunity.